Okay, good evening. Tonight I'll be talking about the next myth that I'll be getting into from Read America. It is a very controversial one. It is called it's called Created Equal, the myth of the melting pot. So it's called the myth of the melting pot. Also, I like to call it the myth of ethnicity or the myth of race. So it's getting a little controversial. So this is relates to page 494 to 496 of Rereading America. The editors introduce Created Equal, the myth of the melting pot. So let's get into that first. So we first had the myth of the melting pot was developed. American concept was developed. What exactly is a melting pot? So imagine, let's just take a little analogy. Imagine the melting pot is basically a hot, scalding pot, a very boiling pot of water, very intolerable. But basically, what happened is that you had all these immigrants from Northern Europe, from different countries, different cultures, different ethnicities, so forth. They all sort of jumped into that melting pot. And what does a melting pot do if it's so hot and so scalding? It actually what mixes together the ethnicities and race in America. And what is the result? It results in a very uniform product, which is an American, as they say, right? An American who's shares similar cultures, values, and beliefs, right? That would be all great, right? America, like there's a new country, a new ethnicity of beings called Americans, right? So that's all sounds fine and dandy. However, our country is very controversial. But remember when I said that Northern Europeans were the ones who were put in the melting pot? So that was what the basis of the melting pot, right? It was only Northern Europeans were put into the melting pot to enjoy becoming an American with all its new cultures, values, and beliefs, and also to grab the American dream. But what happened to the African American slaves who came to USA? What happened to all the Native Americans? What about later immigrants who will be subject to discrimination, such as the Asian Americans, Latinos, and so forth, right? So people who come from Central and the South Americas, all those different peoples of different ethnicity, races, and eventually later people who come from the Middle East, so forth, and a very host of other countries, right? Eastern European countries where Americans have oppressed those people. What all that? So the myth of the melting pot, is basically has that fantastic sounding metaphor, as we say, of people jumping into the melting pot and emerging as Americans, sing the Star Bangle Banger and Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? But of course, that rosy little image is not really the reality. So the myth of the melting pot assumes that all people are created equal, but however, a lot of people, that's very controversial because people are thinking, hey, it's all white people are created equal, right? What about the mirror image of that myth? The myth of racial supremacy. So the myth of the melting pot begets or borns another myth, or basically the image or the opposite, the basic opposite image, the opposite myth, the myth of racial supremacy, right? That's actually like the dark underside of the myth of the melting pot. So basically, with the myth of the melting pot becomes that dark underside called the myth of racial superiority or supremacy. And there the controversy begins, with our history, our country's history of the blacks versus the whites to start off and later on, a lot of different other ethnicities until today it becomes to a full boil with, the recent nomination of our first black president, Barack Obama, right? Everyone thinks, yeah, we're all headed to a new great society. Yet we all learned that in 2016 or so, we had Donald Trump becoming president, and now the controversy and that conflict is all rising up in basically a very unprecedented levels, right? So basically, our country is now in turmoil with that. Uh, People think it's very old and tiring, and we have moved beyond the issue of race. We're all people. We're all created equal. Yet, our country, one of our legacies is racism, and basically something that we as a country, all of us, had to basically live together with and deal with, and basically move forward with. How can we move forward? So basically, the myth of the melting pot, the myth of race, ethnicity, and race. The myth of race is very prevalent and it's very controversial, and time to think critically about it, right? It's a myth, there's an ideal, but what is a reality and how can we move forward from that? So that's basically something that we had to think about and progress from. The first article we'll be reading later will be George Frederickson on the history of American ethnic relations, and he basically talks about four models of racial relations in the USA, from basically racial superiority or supremacy all the way to assimilation, cultural assimilation, that stage. and then finally to pluralism, multiculturalism or pluralism today. And there's also another very controversial racial aspect called separatism. A lot of people want races to be separate from each other, right? Very controversial. So we'll get into some of the controversial articles. And of course, we can definitely relate it today. Our society will be voting soon next week in the election, and we shall see what happens. But right now, our country is this myth is actually a perfect backdrop for what's happening in our country today. And I invite you to think culturally about it, right? Read, talk, think, look with things with an open mind, and we can always learn something new. Right? A lot of us think we know everything about this. We're tired of talking about it. Sometimes students comment like, "Oh, here's Professor Chan coming in with these different topics he thinks are new, and yet we already talked about these topics." Yeah, you already talked about the topics. Obviously, we talked about them, but be open-minded, looking at different perspectives. Try to listen to what other people are trying to say and try to understand them. You may not agree with them at the end of the day, of course, but maybe you may agree with part of them, and you may synthesize and come up with a new solution, blending that person's solution with your solution to make a new solution that both of you can agree to. So have an open mind. Try to learn something new, because there's always new or different things we can learn about all these myths. We have encountered them all before in our lives. It's immersed in us, yet there's some new things we can learn. So the kind of like the lesson or for tonight, or something I urge you all to do is, or kind of beg you to do, is be open-minded. Don't think that you know everything, or shut yourself down for other people. Even someone who's your own worst enemy can actually have a civil discussion with you, right? They may seemingly be your worst enemy, yet if you have a civil discussion and want to learn something they can learn from you, we can actually begin that dialogue, not just yell at each other from opposite sides of the protest, the field of the protest, right? We can protest and yet have a civil discussion. Maybe we can do that. So basically, it's something to think about, the myth of race, and we will read it and continue to talk about it. So until then, I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.